Like, how do you see your own life? Maybe you look at your life and you're like, things are going good. Like, things are kind of working out. I'm on one of those paths where it seems like things are heading in the right direction. But maybe your perspective is maybe opposite of that. Maybe you've just got one of those like real negative, kind of frustrated, like you're in one of those seasons of your life that nothing's working out and your perspective is just real kind of negative. You just kind of, everything you look at is just kind of, eh. Or maybe like, and don't answer this out loud because for obvious reasons, what's your perspective on politics right now? I think some of you are probably sitting there thinking things are going well. I like the way things are going in this country. And I think other people could be sitting there saying, things are kind of a mess right now. It's because we have these different perspectives. And these perspectives is all in how we see things. They change over time, right? The way you view politics might have changed from the way you used to see it. Maybe it's something more personal. Maybe it's something like your perspective on somebody has changed over time. The way you view that person has changed because of something they've done or something they've done to you. Your perspective starts to change. The way you see things starts to change. And I was trying to think, what's a Bible story that goes well with this idea of perspective? And I kept coming back to the story of Adam and Eve. And I say this because the last time I preached, I went back and I looked and I spoke on Adam and Eve. And I realized that you probably shouldn't speak on like the same Bible story like, over and over again. But there's so much to the story. Like the story of Adam and Eve is always one of my favorites because there's so much going on behind the scenes. And when it comes to perspective, I love the story of Adam and Eve and how their perspective changed. So I know that this is a popular story. I know that this is probably a story that you heard growing up. Even if you didn't grow up in the church, this is kind of a story everybody's aware of. And I want to challenge you that I think sometimes what we do with this story is sometimes we think of it in the context of a children's story. Like it's very quick. Like you could probably retell the story in less than a minute. I think, and when we think of the story of Adam and Eve, we think of it as this quick little thing that happened on earth. Like this might be you, because I know this is me sometimes. I think like the world was created in 7 days, and probably by like day 8 or 9, God created Eve, and they probably made it to about 12, day 13, day 14. Maybe they made it 2 weeks, and then they decided to eat from the tree, and bam, the story's over. And sometimes I have this kind of idea that it was just this kind of like, he put him here, it didn't last very long. But I wanted to challenge you to think of this in real life, because in Genesis 2, if you read the beginning of the story, it says, "So God formed the dirt of the ground and all the animals of the field, all the birds of the air. He brought them to the man to see what he would name them, and whatever the man called each living creature, that was its name. The man named the cattle, named the birds of the air, named the wild animals, but he did not find a suitable companion." And there's something I love about this part of the story, because there's this part of the story where it's just Adam and God. Eve hasn't come along yet, and it's just Adam and God hanging out, and God's telling Adam, listen, I'm going to just bring you all these animals, and you just go ahead and choose a name, and whatever you decide to name them, that's what the name's going to be. And I actually sat down this week. We went camping. It was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And when we say camping, if ever the Watsons say camping, it's not camping. Okay, we stay in a cabin, and there's air conditioning. There's a full bathroom. This one even had TV, but it's in the middle of the woods. So we call it camping. It's glamping, I think is the name of it now. So we went glamping, and I got up early Thursday, and I went out to work on this sermon, and I sat down in a chair, and I put it right next to the river, and I'm working on this, and I'm kind of typing stuff up and thinking of this idea, and as I'm sitting there, like, animals are just, like, coming by. Like, this giant snapping turtle, like, swam right in the river, like, he popped his head up, like, right in front of me, and there's, like, a catfish, and there's just different birds, and I'm sitting there thinking, like, this is probably what it was like for Adam. Like, him and God just sitting in a bag chair, just animals walking in front of him, and God's like, what do you want to name this? And it's probably this really cool part of their relationship. And you can see, like, in the beginning, like, the cool animals, like Adam's just throwing out, like, cool names like hippopotamus and rhinoceros. and elephant. I couldn't say elephant for the first 5 years of my life, and I called them lalas. So elephants and these big, long words. And then somehow they went to the animals of the water, the fish, and he's coming up with like cool names like duck-billed platypus, and I'm sure they're just laughing and like, oh, that's really cool. I looked up, there's like the weirdest names like tasseled water gongs and all these really cool like water animals. And what's interesting about this is that it didn't just take days. Like something like this to name animals didn't take months. Bible scholars actually went and researched, because if he was to try to name every animal, and obviously he wouldn't spend 24 hours a day just doing this, but in maybe his waking moments of the day, spending time, even if he didn't take a break, if all he did was just name animals, they estimate that the minimum it would have taken him to name all the animals would have been at least 100 years. So we have this idea of Adam and Eve being this quick story, like they're put on earth, they soon screw up, and then they're gone. But for 100 years, Adam and God hung out just naming animals, just kind of talking. And they said just the name snakes alone, the different species of snakes would have taken probably right around a year. And so this was a special moment between Adam and God, just building this relationship. I like to think that like probably towards the end, because, you know, you go from rhinoceros and hippopotamus, and probably about the year 99, he's like cat, bat, rat. And God's like, dude, they're all rhyming. You got to change it up. He's like, dog. He's like, that's my name spelled backwards. You can't, like, you got to, like, what happened to all, like, the cool names? And so after 100 years, minimum, it could have been 200 years, but think of the relationship. And after that, the very last verse says, but he did not find a suitable companion. So Adam wasn't just naming animals. He wasn't just hanging out with God. He was also kind of looking at each animal thinking, is this something that can bring me friendship, that can bring me companionship while I'm here in the garden? And with each animal that he named, each animal that came by, he realized that's not something that's going to bring me the companionship I need. And so Adam and God had this relationship like no one else on earth besides Jesus. No one else has had such a close relationship with God. And so eventually God decided to make him Eve. And when you go back and you read the story, you can see Adam just kind of stood in awe before Eve. And you have to think that he looked at God and was like, this is just the greatest gift ever. Like, I can't believe you would do this for me. I can't believe that you would give this to me, because this is the kind of relationship that they had. God knew Adam and Eve intimately. And I think Adam and Eve knew more about God than probably what we even come close to. And you know the rest of the story. There's the one tree in the entire garden, in the entire earth, and God says you can't eat from that tree. And you know Eve finds herself there. And the Bible points out, I think, the two mistakes she made. First of all, she was hanging out near the tree. Okay, probably not a good idea. The one thing that you need to stay away from when you find yourself getting closer and closer. And then it says that she was alone, and so she's just kind of setting herself up for failure. And she eats of the fruit, and then she gives it to her husband. And at that moment, it says their eyes were opened. See, at this moment, the way they saw things completely changed. For the first time in their life, they felt uncomfortable. For the first time in their existence in the garden, they felt like things were no longer good. Things weren't the way they were supposed to be. They felt something called shame. They felt something called guilt and regret. And it says all of a sudden they were aware of their nakedness. Before that, they had no reason to even care whether they were naked or not. And now they were no longer comfortable in their own skin. You see, what happened in this moment was their perspective changed. Their perspective was just completely transformed. It was not like this magic eye, like, oh, now I can see something little that was there. Now something's changed with this picture. No, this was everything about their existence was completely different. So I was listening to this podcast a few months ago, and I can't even remember the name of the podcast, but I remember it was something that stuck with me. And I listened to this podcast, and I thought, there's no way that this is true. They're giving all this information, and I thought, there's no way that it's true. But I did my own research, and I found out that the guys that were talking actually kind of knew what they were talking about. And they said that, do you realize that people that lived in the ancient times, humans back then could not see the color blue? And so when I first heard about it, because they're talking about how humans were unable to see the color blue, and a long, long time ago, and I thought, well, maybe it was like a thing where that over the years our eyes have kind of developed or strengthened or been able to see more colors. But that's not it. And they kind of, this was only something recent, maybe back in the 70s, I believe. Somebody realized that in ancient works of literature, the color blue is never mentioned. And this is what kind of sparked the whole topic and the whole research, because they would go back to like things like Homer's Iliad and Homer's Odyssey, like books that you would have read in high school, and they realized that he never says the color blue. Like he's talking about the clear sky, and he calls it a brilliant gray, and then he's talking about the ocean, and he says the water is the color of dark, rich wine. And so they start to notice there's no blue mentioned in any of these works. And then in studying other stuff, they looked at artwork, and they realized that even though the color blue is very easy to make in ancient artwork, there was no really usage of the color blue. And so as they studied this, they realized that it didn't have to do with their eyes. And so they came up with this theory, and they tested this theory in the 90s on an African tribe. It's called the Himba tribe. The Himba tribe is a very primitive, tribal, secluded tribe. Like all the advancement going on around them, they were still very much like the ancient people. And so language experts wanted to test something out because they realized that the Himba tribe did not have a word for the color blue. So what they did was they showed them this color palette. Okay, they showed them this color palette, and they said, which of these squares is different from the others? And through the entire Himba tribe, there was only a couple people that were even able to say, obviously, because for us, we can point out, well, that's the blue one, all the other ones are green. They were only a couple that could look and say, well, something about this square is different. But it took them a really long time. The majority of the tribe looked at this, and they were completely unable to see the color blue. You see, blue doesn't really show up too much in nature, and so they realized that the Himba tribe never really developed a word for the color blue, and so in looking at this color palette, they weren't really able to differentiate between the colors. But the interesting thing with this tribe is that they have many, many, many different words for the color green. See, we have the color green, and then usually like light green, dark green, neon green. We don't stray too far in our colors, but they have so many different words for the color green. So then they showed them this chart, and they said, which of these colors is different? And immediately, as quickly as we were able to say, this one is different because this one's blue, they were able to say, this square is different because this is, whatever name they have for it. And since I know nobody's going to listen and you're going to stare at this until you can figure it out, it's actually this square up here. You just click one more time, right there. And kind of, you can look and be like, that's a little bit different. But to them, they could look, and as quickly as we said that's blue, they said, this square is different. Because they have so many different words for the color green, and so they could see different colors. They have no word for the color blue, and so they couldn't see the color blue. Not because their eyes are any different than ours, but it comes down to language. So the conclusion was, it's language that allows us to see colors. And I heard that, and I thought, there's no way. That is the craziest thing. And I started doing research, and it's true. And across the different languages, depending on how many words they have for a color, depends on how much the people that speak that language can see. So back in the day, there was no word for the color blue, so therefore, they could not see the color blue. So for thousands of years, what that means is that humans lived and died under a blue sky, and they never once was able to see that it was blue. You see, I say this because I believe that evil existed in the garden. I believe that Satan was in the garden all along. It seems weird that Eve would all of a sudden talk or come across the talking snake and not once think, well, this is weird. Like, why is this snake talking to me? It's almost like maybe it's happened before. I think Satan was there all along, and I think evil was there all along, but what happened was Adam and Eve were in such a right relationship with God, it was like there was no word for evil. They had no word for sin, and so they never saw it. It's like they just lived in such perfect harmony with God that everything was good, that everything was right in their world, and they never realized that evil was there all along until they decided to eat from the tree, until they decided to disobey God. And Genesis 3:7 says that at that moment, their eyes were opened. At that moment, their perspective changed. It's like all of a sudden their eyes were able to see the color of shame. And it's not that darkness wasn't around them, but they ate from the tree, and now it's like their eyes were open to see all new things. They were able to see shame and guilt for the first time. They were able to see this new color called darkness, and previously they weren't able to see it. It's like they learned this new word called sin, and now that's all they could see because their perspective changed from never being able to see darkness. It was almost like that's all they could see. They could only see their own shame and their guilt and their regret and all the mistake that they made. And it's almost like they lost the ability to see God. Like they lost the ability to see his love in his comfort, in his peace. Because what happens is God comes into the garden, and after it had happened, and they foolishly tried to run and hide, and God comes down to hang out with them. And he looks around, and the Bible says God calls out, "Where are you? Like, where are you guys at?" And I think he's asking physically, like, where are you guys? I know you're hiding. I know where you are because I'm God and you're hiding behind this bush. But I also think it's like a spiritual kind of thing. Like, where are you guys at spiritually? Like, what's going on where are you at in your life right now? Like, what is this? What are you feeling? And Adam and Eve, they stood there before God naked. They tried to cover themselves up with fig leaves. And they stood there just vulnerable and ashamed and weak and damaged. And at this moment, things were different. And at this moment, their perspective changed from being able to only see God and his love and his peace to being able to see a whole new palette of colors. And they stood there just overwhelmed in their own failure and their own shortcomings. And from then on, everything was different. From then on, the entire story in the Bible changed. And as you read through the Old Testament, you can see that there's God pursuing his people, trying to get back to that relationship that he had with Adam and Eve. Like he's wanting so bad to come back into the lives of people. And some people do, and it might happen for a short time, and then we see the people who would maybe sin or turn their back on God, and then he tries again later on. And I say this so much because when you read the Bible, I want you to think of the Old Testament like it's a love story. It's a love story of God just continually pursuing his people. And God doesn't give up. And then when you get to the end of the Old Testament, there's this time period where God stops showing up and stops talking to people. And there's about a span of about 700 years where nobody heard from God. There was this religious group of Jews that actually preached that God was dead, that something happened to God at this time, and that God had died and left humanity for themselves. But what it was everybody lost the ability to see God because they became so wrapped up looking inward. Their perspective was all about looking inside and what is going on in their life and all the times and the things that they've done that's screwed up and fallen short. But God doesn't give up. And when we come to the part of the New Testament, it's like God saying, okay, I know what I'm going to do. We are going to become human. I'm going to send my son. And then Jesus comes into the picture. And it's like Jesus is all of a sudden giving us a new name for the color of God. Like, he's like, guys, I want to teach you this new color. I want you to be able to see God everywhere you look. He's like, you want to know what God is like? Then look at me. He said, you want to know how God loves people? Then look at me. You want to see how God views people? The way he sees you and the things that you do? Then look at me, and I will show you. And I love the book of John because the book of John introduces Jesus in a different way. See, the book of John reads a lot like the book of Genesis. If you were to open up the book of John now in chapter 1:1, the first things you're going to see is it's going to say, in the beginning. John starts out his book exactly like Genesis because it's like he's trying to say, I want you to feel like you're reading the creation story all over again. But this time it's going to be a new creation. This time things are going to be different. Without getting too nerdy, because I love this kind of stuff, so many times throughout the book he splits things into 7 sections. And when you read it, people that would have understood that, the Jewish people at that time would have thought, okay, 7, it's like in the beginning, the creation story, there's 7 sections. It's like John is telling us the creation story all over again. And throughout the book, he introduces us to a lot of different people and encounters that Jesus had, but 2 of them are with 2 different women. 2 different women that are impacted by shame and guilt and choices that they made in their life. See, the first woman, she's brought before Jesus while he's teaching, and it says that the religious leaders brought her in and threw her in front of Jesus and all the people that are there listening to him. They throw her there and they say, we caught this woman in the act of adultery, and she stands there vulnerable and damaged and weak and naked, trying to cover herself up before the Son of God, just like Adam and Eve when they were first approached by God after they sinned. And everyone's standing around her, and it says all the religious leaders have rocks in their hands. And they're standing there because they caught her in the act of adultery. By law, they can choose to throw stones at her until she dies. And they throw her in front of Jesus, and she stands there just overcome with shame. And Jesus looks around and he says, you guys are all guilty of sin. You guys have all chosen to eat from the tree. He said, if any of you haven't sinned, then just go ahead and throw your rock at her. And it says one by one, it's just this beautiful picture of the men just dropping their stones and walking away because they realize they're guilty of stuff too. And Jesus looks at her and he asks her this question. He says, where are all the men who want to condemn you? And the one person standing there without sin was Jesus. The one person that's standing there who legally could have thrown a rock at her was Jesus. And he stands in front of her and he says, I don't condemn you either. He says, go and leave your life of sin. You see, in this new creation story, in this new story that John is telling us, it's not about the sin that changes everything. When we read the story of Adam and Eve, it's all about the sin. The sin is the thing that just changes the entire layout of the story. It's not about the sin that changes everything. When Jesus comes, it's all about his grace. It's his grace and his mercy that change things. And then we're introduced to another woman in the book of John. That they call her the woman at the well. Some of the translations will call her the Samaritan woman. Because Jesus and his disciples, they take a shortcut through this land called Samaria. And normally Jews hated Samaritans so much that they would rather walk an extra 3 days to go around this area instead of cut through it. That's how much they hated the Samaritans. And Jesus said, no, we're just going to walk right through. Like, I got places to go. And they walk through, and he sends his disciples into town to get something to eat because he sees this woman who's drawing water from the well, and he decides that he's going to go over and talk to her. John points out that it is noon why this is all happening, and which kind of leads to some speculation. Because in the middle of the desert, noon probably would have been about the hottest part of the day. And typically women would go and get water probably more in the mornings when it's still cooler. Still in third world countries where women will go get water, they do so in the morning because noon, that's the hottest part of the day. And so Jesus knows there's something going on. We don't know what it was that she did or why she's there, but he knows there's a reason why she chooses to come at noon. There's a reason why she skips the crowd of the other women so she can come and be by herself, because she chooses the hottest part of the day to get her water. And so Jesus walks over and he sits and he talks to her. First of all, it had been unheard of for a Jewish person to talk to a Samaritan. Secondly, it would be even more unheard of for a man to talk to a woman, especially a man of Jesus' stature. But Jesus sits down and he has this conversation. He knows that there's a reason why she's ashamed of something. There's a reason why she's hiding. And just like God did with Adam and Eve, he asks a question. He asks this question he kind of already knows the answer to. And he says, where's your husband? Go get your husband and bring him back, and let's sit and talk. She says, well, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, I know. He's like, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now isn't your husband. But he sits and he talks to her. He doesn't condemn her. He doesn't make her feel bad about her choices or anything that's happened. He simply just tells her what he's all about. Because remember, it's no longer about what we've done. It's no longer about the choices we've made or the things that we've done. It's all about what Jesus has done. And Jesus came to change our perspective. Jesus wanted to change her perspective from thinking inward to the stuff that's happened to her life and to start thinking about him and who he is. I always tell people when they choose to start coming to church and they choose to be a Christian and they choose to become a follower of Jesus, probably the hardest thing isn't necessarily changing the way you live. Oftentimes, I think it's changing the way we think. It's not just about like stop doing certain things or start doing certain things. The hardest part is sometimes changing the way our minds work, the way we see things, the way we think. You see, it's hard because our brains are created to filter out so many things. Like right now, if you pay attention, if you're completely quiet right now, like you can hear the hum of the air conditioner. Like if you're up here, you could probably hear like a slight buzz of the sound system. There's noises that you can hear that you can filter out. You could hear the mouth breather that's sitting next to you if you get real quiet. If you can't hear it, it's probably you. If you're like, I can't hear a mouth breather, it's you. Breathe through your nose. It's better for you. But what our mind does is it filters all these extra noises out. This is the biggest struggle with people with autism is that their mind isn't able to filter out all these noises, and so what happens is they struggle with sensory overload. You see, and this is what our brains do as Christians, I think, because what happens when we screw up, when we fall short, when we have this sin in our life, what's the thing that we start focusing on? We start focusing on that sin. And then it's like our brain is just bringing in all the past times that we've screwed up. And then the times from like 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 15 years ago. And it's like, it's just bringing in all this stuff. And then what does it filter out? It filters out all the God stuff. Because this is when people come up and they say, you know what, I just don't feel like God speaks to me. It's because all the stuff that's going in your brain is all the bad stuff. You know, you go through difficult times and things get tough. And then what do you start thinking of? All the times before when you struggled, and all the times before when things were bad, and you're like, oh, why is my life like this? Why is my life so difficult? When you're dealing with this junk, it's like your brain's constantly filtering out the God stuff. But the good news is the opposite is true. Because when your perspective changes, when you spend time praying and really getting to know God, when you spend time reading your Bible, what happens is you start to see God everywhere. When you grow in your relationship with God, it's like your brain is suddenly able to filter out the shame and the guilt and the regret and all those negative things. And it's like your brain is just focusing you on the love of God and the grace of God and his mercy. And you start to just see God everywhere. And you're like, oh my gosh, there's God. And you're not even thinking about all that junk in your past. One part of the story of Adam and Eve that I think we overlook is what happened after they sinned. See, God originally said, if you eat from this tree will lead to death. And it did. It eventually led them. They from then on, they gradually got old. And hundreds of years later, they died. But not right away. So there was still this little bit of grace and mercy being shown. And then I love this part of the story. And this is one that I think we just overlook so much. Because in one final act of love, it says that God sewed together some clothing for Adam and Eve. Like picture this big, powerful, all-knowing God taking time to sit down and sew clothes for Adam and Eve. Which means that he replaced the fig leaves that they were wearing, trying to cover up with. And and he instead used the hide of an animal. See, up to this point, the garden, it wasn't like one of those Planet Earth documentaries that you watch and it's just animals killing animals and chasing animals. Up until this point, that's not the way the earth was. But because of their sin, things changed. Things are different now. Because of their sin, an animal needed to be sacrificed. Something needed to die. And we jump ahead to the book of John, and Jesus confronts these two women. Remember, vulnerable, just standing completely ashamed of what they've done, and completely weak in their life, just feeling completely damaged and broken. And again, because of sin, something needed to die. And that something was Jesus. And Jesus willingly chose to go to the cross. Jesus willingly said, let me be the one to die because of our sin, so that we don't need to deal with the shame and the guilt and the regret anymore. And so the question today is the same question that God asked Adam and Eve when they were in the garden. When he calls out, where are you? Not physically. Where are you at spiritually? Where are you at in your life right now? What are you carrying around that's just weighing you down? God's saying, where are you? What's that? Let's talk about that shame that you've got in your life. That shame that's just causing you to just completely push God out and only just focus on the screw up that you are. Like, what's controlling your perspective? What's the thing that's just completely overwhelming your thoughts that you can't even see God in your daily life? Where are you today? My absolute favorite Bible verse is Matthew 11:28. Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Read that. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Such a beautiful statement by Jesus. I know I'm not the only person in the room that gets worn down and tired by everything that life has thrown at us, but Jesus is saying, guys, just give it to me. Give it to me. I will gladly trade you. You give me the stuff that wears you down. You give me the stuff that's caused that you're trying to keep hidden from other people. You give me that shame that you're struggling with that's causing you to want to just run and hide. Those feelings that you got to live up to someone else's standards. Give those to me. Give those to me. And in return, I will give you rest. I will give you a relationship where you can feel the comfort and the peace in your relationship with God. If there's one thing I want you to remember today, it's that because of Jesus, our perspective can be changed. Because of Jesus, no longer is your story about that sin in your life, that struggle, that screw up. Your story is no longer about sin. Your story is all about Jesus' grace and his love and his mercy. And it's because of that grace. It's the reason why we come and we worship him. And right now, I just want to ask that we stand and we do just that. We spend some time worshiping the God that looks past our sin, that takes away our shame, and we focus on that grace and love. There's a verse in John that talks about the woman at the well. In John 4:39, it says, many Samaritans from that town believed in Jesus because of her testimony. See, in the Bible, we're only introduced to her very briefly in the book of John. There's not a whole lot written about her. But there's out of the Bible resources, historians that have written stuff about that time. And there's a couple different sources that talk about this woman. They give her a name, and they actually said her name was changed after that to Fatini, which means the enlightened one. And she almost became this missionary. They write of how she became a missionary in this area of Samaria and just telling so many people about Jesus and changing lives. And And the story goes, or maybe the legend goes, that she eventually moved to Rome. She moved to the capital, and she decided, I'm going to go and I want to continue to teach about Jesus. And they talk about how she was making such an impact in the capital of Rome that the Roman Emperor Nero actually had her killed. He killed her by throwing her into a well because of the story she was so well known for. She was making such an impact that she got the attention of the Roman emperor, all because that she was able to get to know this guy named Jesus, this guy that knew everything she did, and instead he looked past all her sin and instead looked at her potential. And she took that and she went and she's considered a martyr within the Christian church. See, Jesus wants to free you from your shame. Jesus wants to free you from your guilt and your regret. Jesus wants to change our perspective. All those times we get so weighed down thinking about all the negative stuff and everything going on that our perspective changes. He wants to change it back and to focus on his love and his grace and for us to allow that love and grace to be able to go out and change other people. It's funny because I've been working on this for a while, and for some reason, every time I would sit down and work on this sermon, I would get Hank Williams Sr. stuck in my head. Like, I saw the light, and I asked Jeff about it, and our band is awesome. They learned it, really quick. I don't know why I got the song stuck in my head, but I look at the lyrics and thinking about this in the chorus. I saw the light, no more darkness, no more night. Now I'm so happy, no sorrow in sight. Praise the Lord, I saw the light. Let's pray. God, just help us to change our perspectives. God, help us to become so overwhelmed in your love and your grace that we just experience so much joy that we're unable to see anything else. We're unable to see all the shame and the sin that weighs us down. And God, like the color blue, God, just sometimes we lack the words to be able to see you around us. God, help us to be able to focus on you and see you at work in our life. God, thank you for your grace. Thank you for looking past our sin. We love you and thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.